one of the truly great socio-legal researchers on the legal profession. I don't think there's any question he's the leading researcher of his generation. He's been involved in many of the most important research projects on the legal profession, starting when he was just a graduate student at Northwestern. He's been the director of the American Bar Foundation and a longtime faculty member both in the sociology department at Northwestern as well as the law school, and a great friend and mentor of mine over the years. And pretty much any good idea or research method I've ever had, I pretty much stole from Bob Nelson. And Bob is going to talk about a project that we haven't been working on it as long as we've known each other. It's getting to be
damn close.
Yeah, very long in the tooth, and I'll let him describe it to you. But as our usual, Bob has a bunch of information to convey, but please feel free to ask questions as we go along. I know he would appreciate that. We'll have some time at the end for Q&A, and as he'll show you, a lot of the material that he'll talk about is actually available in written form in publications or online, and all of it, God willing, will be pulled together in a book that we are currently working on and hope to be done with soon. So, Bob Nelson.
Okay, well, I have this talk written out, and so I'll just sort of go through it, but feel free to interrupt. And some of this is pretty, straight ahead sociology and stratification applied to the legal profession, but hopefully it'll come together. And thanks, David. It's always a pleasure to be here. And the leading scholar on the legal profession in my generation. Are you in a different generation? I don't know.
I'm trying to act
years,
like
we'll just pretend that's the case.
Well, even if I'm not, it's still the case.
Okay, so what I'm doing today is presenting the tale of two lawyers to look at the question of upward mobility in the legal profession. And this is the story of Alicia, who we interviewed at 3 points in the AJD study, and Constance, who we interviewed just once in wave 3, more recently in her career. As this slide sort of summarizes, these women come from slightly different social backgrounds. Alicia is a white woman in a major market. She graduated from what Heinz Lohmann would have referred to as a local law school, while Constance graduated from the night program of a regional law school while holding down a full-time job during the day. Alicia comes from a slightly more advantaged social background than Constance. So at the beginning of her career, Alicia seemed like an overachiever for a graduate of a local law school. She landed a job in a medium-sized firm that did business litigation. And in the first interview that we did with her 3 years in, she was brimming with confidence about her life. And she said, I know definitely within 5 years I will be married and will have at least one child, most likely 2. And I know my goal is to be partner within 5 years from now and hopefully slightly sooner. But then when we interviewed her the second time at wave 2, some 9 years into her career, there were clear warning signs about her prospects at the law firm. She said, I'm hitting that 9-year mark. I was up last year for making partner, and obviously I didn't get it. I look at some of the gentlemen who've made partner just from my group, and they haven't had to go through what I've gone through. I had an epiphany with regard to partnership that no matter what, I'm a good lawyer. I don't need the title partner to be a good lawyer. Would I like it? Yes, but I don't need it. It doesn't change my work quality. It doesn't change who I am. It doesn't change anything about me. And then when we interviewed her at wave 3, she had left the law firm and had moved to an inside counsel position in a major bank. She had heard that she did not make partner because, quote, she was not pretty enough. And although not making partner was, quote, very painful, she was, quote, back to feeling excited about being a lawyer. Coming here changed my way of thinking about the law, changed my way of thinking about me. past 2 years have been amazing. I worked really hard, yes, but me as a human, I'm happier. So Constance started her career in a way that you might predict for the graduate of a night program of a regional law school. She built connections from her day job as a social worker. While she was going to law school, she interned and got a job with the district attorney's office. She started in the domestic violence division of the DA's office, moved to gang violence, which was a promotion. And there she continued to build her resume, following the advice of a former DA to, quote, try your first murder case and get out, because once you get to that point, you've got everything from a training perspective, and then they're going to suck you dry. So she happened into another career-building move after prosecuting an attorney for coaching a witness to commit perjury, and working with an expert witness on lawyers' ethics, who was so impressed with her that he said that he would hire her into his boutique professional ethics law firm. And eventually she made that move. And then that boutique joined a large national law firm with offices around the country, where she was made partner as part of a lateral move of the boutique into the firm. And she reflected on the fact that she could never have seen this path while in law school. I don't think anybody in law school knows that this is a thing. And she reports that she has the flexibility she needs to be a single parent, because nobody knows where I am. I work at home a lot, I'm on the road. The LinkedIn pages for Alicia and Constance in 2019, LinkedIn is now a great resource for following up the current location of lawyers, shows that Alicia has since moved to another large bank, but an even more authoritative position, and that Constance is still an equity partner in the same large national law firm. So the stories of Alicia and Constance exemplify the central themes of the book that David and I are writing, and their stories are rooted in and take meaning in the structures of the American legal profession, but also reveal the part of personal agency in the making of lawyer careers. Their stories are emblematic of how gender, race, and class hierarchies shape the career prospects of lawyers, but are not deterministic of those outcomes. These social hierarchies structure the careers of lawyers, but it is not a caste system. So here's a somewhat daunting overview of the presentation that we're going through today. So I'm going to discuss the theory that we're working from. I'll discuss the research methods of our AJD study. Spend most of the time looking at the role of gender, race, and class in shaping the career paths of lawyers, starting from where they get into law school, where they start their career, and where they are at mid-career, which is the last time that we interviewed them. Then I will look at some work on gender inequality in the earnings of lawyers, and then some data on self-reports of discrimination in the legal workplace, something we're going to talk about at greater length in David's class this afternoon, and then discuss the implications of these results for inequality and opportunity in the American legal profession. So why study lawyers' careers? So there are many possible reasons. Maybe you're a lawyer, maybe you're a law student, maybe you're a friend of David Wilkins, maybe you work for the American Bar Foundation, which is an organization funded by lawyers. But there are serious sociological reasons. First, it is a large occupational system that is characterized by considerable stratification and social change, and it raises a lot of issues about the role of professions in society. Second, a lot of what law does in society depends on how lawyers are organized and what they do. So diversity in the legal profession, along the lines of race, gender, and class, may affect the role that law plays in increasing or ameliorating social inequality along those axes. And certainly the distribution of lawyers' time among different kinds of clients will reflect the relative resources of different segments of society within law. So here I juxtapose contemplative photos of Jack Hines, who is my mentor, former director of the ABF and a leading figure in research on the legal profession, and Pierre Bourdieu, the famous French sociologist. Hines and his co-author Ed Lauman made a lasting contribution to theories of the American legal profession by documenting famously the existence of two hemispheres in the legal profession, one serving corporate clients and one serving personal clients. And while the Chicago bar in 1975 was mostly white and mostly male, they found striking differences in the ethno-religious characteristics of lawyers working in different fields of law. Anglo-Saxon Protestants dominated corporate and securities work, Irish Catholics dominated trial work, Jewish lawyers were vastly overrepresented in divorce work. And when Hines and collaborators replicated their study 20 years later in 1995, they still found that there was significant segmentation of the practice of law, but that the crude ethno-religious segregation of fields of law had largely disappeared. In both studies, Hines and colleagues demonstrated
He's one of the colleagues.
the legal profession, after it all, it doesn't matter, right? Demonstrated that the legal profession was a status hierarchy that linked the types of clients lawyers served, the fields of law in which they practiced, and the status of the law schools they attended. And from 1975 to 1995, they documented the increasing dominance of work for business clients, growing from rough parity in 1975 to a 2-to-1 ratio in favor of business by 1995. So the current study is informed by Bourdieu's theory of social capital, which sees the legal field as a field of power, in which actors within the field adopt strategies oriented toward success within the field. Strategies are not necessarily chosen instrumentally or even self-consciously. Rather, actors internalize the rules of the game such that it seems natural, and they try to build up the capital that is valued in the field or find ways to get the capital they possess to be valued within the field. Lauren Rivera's recent work on hiring practices in investment banks, management consulting firms, and elite law firms is a beautiful example of this kind of approach, as she finds that evaluators, basically the hiring partners at those firms, tended to look for, quote, qualities similar to their own. That is, not just elite educational degrees, but playing the right kinds of sports, taking the right kinds of vacations. The social capital perspective recognizes the socially constructed nature of the credentials and professional accomplishments that make up the status hierarchies of law. And because the actors in the field of law often believe in the markers of status and accomplishment, they have real consequences. Social capital theory offers a different explanation for patterns of inequality in law than orthodox economic theory, the theory of human capital developed famously by Gary Becker. When Hines and Lauman surveyed Chicago lawyers, there were a few women and few people of color in the practice. By 95, the numbers had grown, but still were a relatively small presence in the profession. Today, as I assume almost everyone knows, women make up 30% of lawyers, close to half of lawyers under the age of 40. People of color make up about 20% of American lawyers, divided roughly equally between African Americans, Latinx, and Asian Americans. And corresponding to the rising presence of these groups in the profession, we've seen the rising significance of scholarship on gender and race in the profession. So there is a substantial body of feminist scholarship on law and lawyering. There is growing work on intersectionality. You can see hiding behind pedigree, cover of the book Acting White by Devin Carbato and Mitu Galati that addresses those intersectionality issues. Mitu, of course, is one of Professor Wilkins' early co-authors in work on this profession. So here's the cast of characters of the AJD project. And we've had a group of experts that has been working on this project really preceding 2000. And we've pursued a very ambitious research design. 3 waves of data collection in 2003, 2007, 2012. Nationally representative sample across different kinds of markets within the legal profession. Minority oversample. Very high response rates. And so we've interviewed 5,300 different lawyers. We have over 10,000 interviews. 36% of the initial sampling frame, we have interviewed for all 3 waves. And then we also have the in-depth interviews, like we heard from Alicia and Constance. So you can see why it's taken a while to generate the book, and we're still working. So here's the general model of the stages of lawyers' careers that I'm going to walk through with you with a lot of numbers. And so we start with social background, look at its impact on relationship to undergraduate status, its impact on law school selectivity, the impact of law school selectivity on early career practice setting. So basically wave 1 practice setting in our study, and then wave 3 practice setting 12 years in, so the mid-career practice setting. So first I'm going to present 3 descriptive tables, just to highlight in simple terms what's going on, and then we'll get into some more multivariate stuff. So here we've highlighted the race, ethnicity, and gender of our sample by a set of background characteristics and then educational characteristics. And we've highlighted in green and yellow sort of differences from the sample. Low values are in green and high in yellow. What we see basically here is very few differences by gender. There are almost no differences between men and women on all of these characteristics. But we do see distinctive patterns by race and ethnicity. While 22% of the overall sample had parents who were foreign-born, a majority of Latinx respondents and 87% of Asian Americans did. African Americans, Latinx, and Native American respondents come from less advantaged backgrounds, looking at parents' education and occupation. Yet, in terms of educational credentials, people of color do well compared to whites, posting relatively high percentages from top 25 either research universities or top 25 colleges as undergraduates, and then also graduation from top 10 law schools. So for example, 16% of African Americans graduated from top 10 law schools compared to 9% of whites. But still, given the relative size, the relative number of whites in our sample, there are many more white graduates from top 10 law schools in our sample than African Americans, 310 compared to 81. So then, when we look at wave 1 practice setting, we begin to see somewhat more differentiation by race and gender. We're highlighting just 4 of the practice areas within the sample. It's not the entire sample, but the big ones. Solo and law firms up to 20 lawyers, which are about 30% of the sample. Large law firms of 251 or more, which are 20% of our sample at wave 1. State government, which is 14% of the wave 1 sample, and working in business, either as inside counsel or not practicing, which makes up just 9% of the sample at wave 1. The distribution across these practice settings is pretty similar by race and ethnicity, except in state government, where we see more African Americans, Latinx, and Native Americans, and fewer whites. And we see somewhat more Asian Americans in business. Women are somewhat less likely to practice as solos or in small firms, and are more likely to work for state government. Then this adds wave 3, so we have columns for wave 1 and wave 3, and we can see the changes across these groups, across the waves. Again, the distribution is, there's relatively little change for solos and small firms, but we see a major move out of large law firms, dropping from 20% of the sample at wave 1 to 90% of the sample, pretty much across all race and gender groups. We see incremental growth in state government employment for African Americans and women. We see a major growth in business jobs, from 9% in wave 1 to 22% in wave 3. It's a pattern you're probably all familiar with.
And those include both practicing law and not practicing law.
That's correct.
So in other words, it includes both in-house counsel positions and also people who move into business, which is, you're probably not going to do this here, but is a very heterogeneous category. It can include fancy Wall Street investment bankers and people who are selling insurance or working in a state, a kind of local business or their own business.
Yeah. And so it's about 2/3 inside counsel, 1/3 not practicing. And I think we're beginning to see a bit of a status differentiation so that inside counsel are more prestigious in terms of their backgrounds than people who are not practicing. But there are a few of those, Wall Street bankers. So now let's move into the multivariate analysis. And most of what I'm going to do is show you these kinds of diagrams, just summarizing the results of more complex models that look like this. This is the model that is predicting law school status for our sample. And you can see that we find that selectivity of law school, I've highlighted below this is just the prediction we're getting into, the significant effects we're getting into a top 10 law school. So some of them are just straightforward meritocratic credentials, undergraduate GPA, LSAT, undergraduate institution, but there is also a net benefit for African Americans and Latinx in getting into elite law schools. So there is a bit of a mixture of social capital and educational credentials that we see here, but what should be made very clear is that undergraduate GPA and LSAT are overwhelmingly important in predicting enrollment in top schools. So the pseudo R-squared, which is the amount of variance in these measures that we can explain in this model, goes from 0.07, 7% to 0.25, 25%, just by adding undergraduate GPA and LSAT. So this is the fuller model, but this is like another byproduct that we can generate from these models. What this shows is the predicted probability for law school rank by race and ethnicity, and you derive these probabilities by setting the other variables at their mean and then looking at different groups. So you can see the blue line for African Americans, much higher percentage getting into top 10 and top 20 law schools, and even into 21 to 50 law schools. Much lower for the other groups, controlling for those probabilities. Okay, so then,
just to come back to this for a second. So these are the probabilities, but this doesn't say anything about the numbers, right?
Correct. That is correct.
So one thing some of you may have, I don't know, did we do Goodwin's thing when he did his law school admissions thing? No, I don't think we've done it for a group like this. So Goodwin Liu, just for those of you who are interested, is about to publish this very interesting data on who goes to law school. And what they're looking at are the numbers by racial group of people in different tiers of law schools. And there, in some ways, it's almost the exact opposite of this, that whites and Asians are by far disproportionately located in the top law schools by numbers, and that blacks and Latinos are by far concentrated in the lowest tier law schools, the tier 4 and 3 and 4. Yeah. Okay. So it's an interesting thing, right? So that there's, in other words, this shows, I suppose you might call it an affirmative action effect, right? I assume holding everything else constant, that being black and Latino is an advantage in getting in schools, but that overwhelmingly the majority of blacks and Latinos are going to lower tier law schools. So it's a bit of a bimodal distribution if you think about it. Anyway, just to put that in some context, we'll send you, Goodwin's paper is really going to be interesting on this.
Yeah, and I mean, I actually prefer to call it diversity as opposed to affirmative action.
Yeah, okay.
Affirmative action is such a loaded term.
Yes, true.
But, and also the thing to keep in mind is that our sample are people who graduated from law school and passed the bar. And so it is a, selective group, right? So within this group, it's not the odds at the outset, right? So
how does gender graft onto this?
Almost no difference.
Almost no difference
by gender. Okay, so now if we're moving to predicting early career practice setting, we're using similar kinds of predictors, and we've highlighted Again, featuring just one practice setting, the large law firm. We see that African Americans are more likely than whites to work in large law firms. What we don't show here, but is also true, more likely to be in the federal government and in the nonprofit sector. Parents' education and occupation, when you control for law school status, are no longer significant, so all the effect is washed out. But then graduating from a top 10 law school and being African American is associated with the first job in a large law firm. And then the estimated probabilities, we do that again. This is just for comparing top 10 law school graduates and tier 3 and tier 4 graduates. What you can see is that tier 3 and tier 4 graduates are much more likely to be in solo and small firms, at the start of their careers. Those from top 10 law schools are much more likely to be in large firms, like almost a 50% chance. Okay. Then when we move to the final phase, to predicting wave 3 practice setting, we find that there are some persistent effects for African Americans to work in government and for women to work in the nonprofit sector. But by far the most powerful set of predictors is wave 1 practice setting. So the estimated probabilities that we see here. So this is the probability of what your wave 3 practice setting is going to be if you practice in a large law firm at wave 1. And you can see there are 2 big bumps, right? So it's the bump that remains at the large law firm, and then the huge bump for business, moving from large law firms to inside counsel, and it's mostly inside counsel, for this group.
And how does that look for gender?
Gender is different. Women are much more likely to be in state government and in nonprofits. Yeah, and we could go to the full model. I've got it saved at the bottom of the deck if you want to go into some more of those details. So what we're seeing is that all 3 of our independent variables, gender, race, and class, are at work in the system. Some in obvious, some in unexpected, and some in subtle ways. As a reflection of social capital, parents' education and status of undergraduate institution affects the chances of getting into a law school, but so too does a membership in a traditionally disadvantaged racial or ethnic group. These effects are dwarfed in significance by competitive entry credentials, undergraduate GPA, LSAT. Law school status heavily shapes the prospects for entry-level positions, and entry-level positions in turn heavily influence positions at wave 3. But race and gender continue to have an effect, with African Americans and women more likely to move into government practice in wave 3. Okay. So what is subtle in the interaction of race and gender in these career moves is crude when we're looking at money. And so, first of all, just beginning with looking at labor force participation by gender, and this is the last 2 waves, so we can focus on wave 3. You can see there are dramatic differences in labor force participation, so that almost all men are working full-time, but a quarter of women are working either part-time or are unemployed.
And this is true, by the way, of Harvard Law School graduates, and for some of you have seen, we have a career study of Harvard Law School graduates, and that 25% who are not working full-time either, so in other words, out of the workforce or part-time, was even true something like 8 to 10 years out for Harvard Law School women.
Interesting, yeah. And then this is the simple breakdown by practice setting for men and women. And you can see that even among full-time workers, this is limited to full-time workers. Overall, women make 80% of men in the profession, with larger differentials in some contexts, private law firms and business, and much closer in the government and the nonprofit sector.
So this is a really important chart for those of you who are interested in gender and wage disparities, because most times when you see that number, women make 70 cents on the dollar for everything, and they don't control for work setting. And so, it gets skewed by the fact that men work in categories of jobs that are much more lucrative than women. But this controls for the work setting. Now, it's not a perfect control. We're not looking at men and women in the same law firm, but we are controlling for the huge difference in the salaries, for example, paid by, big law firms to state government or something like that. So this actually controls a lot for things that typically people say, oh, that the wage disparity is being driven by the fact that of institutional setting. So this shows, even accounting for that, there's a huge variable in many, and really huge in some of these settings.
So this goes even farther, right? This shows the multivariate controls for what we refer to as the wave 1, 2, 3 sample, all 3 waves. And so there's a lot of practice setting, basic human capital variables that we include. So just practice setting, you get up to 28% of the variance explained. When you add position within organization, whether you're a partner or a general counsel or a manager, it goes up to 33%. When you add full-time and hours worked, when you add city size, you get up to 42%, towards the far right over there. But then still, when we add in female, with all those other controls, there's still a statistically significant effect.
Yeah.
So it's unexplained, and we didn't show on this chart, but we looked at race and social background and law school status, and those are not significant in this model, and don't explain away, this pattern.
The gender effect.
Right.
So see, this is about as rigorous as you're gonna get at looking at a gender wage analysis, and still 50% of the variance is unexplained.
Yeah,
Meaning-
true. That's true. I mean, 45% is very good for
45%,
sociology.
yes. Yeah.
Kind of, anyway, better than the LSAT predicted first year. law
Yeah,
school
think about
grades.
that. I
Way-
mean,
way
things
better.
that we put a lot of emphasis on, like the LSAT. This is way, way, way better at prediction.
That's right. So finally, I turn to a more direct approach to the role of social hierarchies in the legal profession. This is the paper we're going to be talking about in David and Brian's seminar this afternoon. We asked people whether they had experienced, and each way we asked people whether in the last 2 years they had experienced discrimination in the workplace, looking at these different kinds of discriminatory experiences, and if they had experienced any of them, we counted that as discrimination and then ran our analyses based on that. This is the breakdown by gender and sexual orientation, gender, race, and sexual orientation. And what you can see is a very clear hierarchy in which, at the top, African Americans experience, so this is self-reported discrimination, okay? African Americans at the top, followed by Latinx, Asian American, and then white. And in each group, women reporting more discrimination than men. And then for sexual orientation, we see pretty significant differences. There is more of an effect for LGBTQ men than LGBTQ women. It seems like a lot of their experiences are tied up with being a woman, so they're experiencing gender bias, and so there's not as much of a difference, but there is quite a bit of a difference for LGBTQ men. So in the paper that we're going to talk about this afternoon, we provide a lot of controls and statistical analyses to look at this. What we were surprised about was that there was very little difference across sector in these numbers, so that private sector, public sector, business, they're very similar. So that was a bit of a surprise for us.
Is this any kind of discrimination on this chart?
Yeah, it's these types here.
So
But then we did, in the paper, we code, there's also a comment field, and we could ask them what kind of experience they suffered, and then we coded that qualitatively, but then also tabulated it.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, like, if they check one of these boxes.
Anyone, yes, anyone, right.
Right.
Correct, yeah. Okay, so to wrap up, so what we're finding is that there are powerful structures that affect the career trajectories of lawyers. Race, gender, and class are shot through these structures and have cross-cutting effects that are difficult to separate. Yet when we turn to more immediate aspects of professional life, like how much women lawyers make compared to their male counterparts, or the likelihood that women of color, men of color, and LGBTQ attorneys will perceive discrimination in the workplace. You see more straightforward patterns of inequality. And connecting these broad structural patterns to the lived experience of lawyers from different class backgrounds, races, and genders is the central focus of the book. So if we return to the stories of Alicia and Constance, we can see the connection between structure and strategy in the sense that Bourdieu and even Heinz and Laumann might mean it. Alicia had survived what she reported as gender discrimination at her first employer, becoming a statistic in the high attrition rates of women from large law firms, but also following a statistically common pattern to find employment as an inside counsel in business, making less than at the law firm, but once again, happy to be a lawyer. And Constance's success story, which is made up of graduating from a night law school, making connections in a DA's office, making connections with a recognized expert in a boutique legal specialty, making lateral moves as a partner into a national law firm, presents the possibility that individuals can achieve personal success even as the structure of the legal profession produces unequal outcomes for most women and people of color. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. It's a amazingly rich set of data. So questions, comments on kind of anything? Could be also just on general stuff about the study. Yeah, please.
So I noticed you have some very thorough models and descriptive statistics regarding the gender gap in terms of income. And I was really curious to understand whether you have any theories to explain the mechanism behind that. What are some of the ideas that you're considering, and which ones do you find more credible than others, or and such? I'd love to hear more about the analysis.
Great.
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you.
I mean, because it really is, gender comes through in a much more striking way even than race, certainly in terms of like earnings, right? Which is striking. I mean, I think it has to do with the gender hierarchies in all these different organizational locations. So in law firms, and we do have a lot of measures about like client responsibility in book of business,
So
which we have not yet really applied yet to try and decompose this. I think a lot of it does work through those mechanisms. But then I think it's that the women are just treated differently in these different and especially in the for-profit contexts.
So Bob, you want to talk a little bit about something you're going to talk about in the other paper, which is what you might call the perverse promotion or supervisory effect. Which so you want to talk about that, because
Sure.
this is an interesting, I think, way in which you can begin to understand how even as people move up, that they face not only the same barriers but maybe different ones. So
Yeah.
go ahead.
So what David's referring to there is the finding that female supervisors are more likely to experience discrimination than other women. And it's part of the theory. I mean, this is sort of a well-established finding in other organizational studies in which women pose a threat as they assume supervisory positions, and therefore you might think that they would be less subject to discrimination because they're more powerful, but they're also more threatening, and so there's a reaction against that. So
it makes me think of physics, which is friction. It's proportional to speed. So the more you move, like the more resistance you encounter as a moving through space.
I like that.
So
Can
it's kind of similar.
Can we steal that as an analogy? Or I'm
Yes,
sorry,
like-
can we borrow that and credit you? But it is a
Physics, not me. But
well, no, but it's a very interesting and somewhat counterintuitive dynamic, and it appears to be working more for gender than for race, because in the things on race, you see it doesn't show up as an independently significant effect. And this goes to the intersectionality point where, because again, you saw black women, for each of the categories, women experiencing more discrimination than men.
yes.
And then if you add this part onto it, one of the things that you might think of would help you, which is actually to become, to get promoted and to become more powerful, actually ends up reinforcing. So it's a very, I think, interesting and powerful finding. Yeah, Lyle?
There's the whole study of well-being of lawyers that I'm sure aware of, and but as far as I recall, it is not sliced up at all. The Massachusetts Steering Committee on Lawyer Well-being broke the practice settings up, but didn't have a whole lot to say about these questions. Although it did say inclusivity was a really important issue because people were feeling excluded or they were being treated differently, and that was sort of a subset of why they were unhappy, not only there were other things. I was just curious, is there any sense of sort of the distribution of that 20 to 25% of the population of lawyers who are in some sort of emotional difficulty at any time in these cohorts?
Well, one of our surprising findings is that on average the lawyers are very satisfied, and that is true for traditionally disadvantaged groups. It's true for
Yeah.
women. As well
On
as men.
general levels of, would you do this again? Are you satisfied with your career? Very high levels, like 75 or 80%.
I mean, one of the nice things about the in-depth interviews is that we get those those patterns. They're very robust, and it's very different than the blogosphere suggests. When you ask people in the in-depth interviews whether they would advise a relative to go to law school, you get a much more nuanced answer, which is like, I'm not sure. It's not for everybody.
Yeah.
You've got to work really hard, like this one guy said. I wouldn't want my daughter to become a lawyer because of how hard it is. But they usually do say something like, well, if you really know what you want to do, if you have a strong sense of what you want to get into, do it. But it's more nuanced than
So
just,
here, so the Harvard Law School data, have you seen our Black alumni study, Lyle? So you can download this off our website, but we'll send you the link. We found one of the most striking findings. So this is a survey of 850 Black Harvard Law School alums. And what we were particularly interested in was within race, gender differences. So gender differences between Black women and men. And one of the most striking ones was that if you ask the sample as a whole, would you, are you satisfied with your career as a lawyer, or would you go to law school again? Something like 85, 88%, almost 90% say yes, even though they've experienced all sorts of episodes of discrimination and disappointment, and which they've reported throughout the whole survey. But then, if you ask, would you recommend law to a young person today? The number goes from almost 90% to just over 60%. There's like a 30% drop. And then if you look at it by gender, Black women are much less likely to recommend law as a career than men. And if you look at people who graduated after 2000 as opposed to before 2000, it's down to something like 42% would recommend that a young person go to law school. So, as I say, this is a disaster for the profession. But Lyle, the other thing about AJD, which we haven't yet fully explored, although I guess Gabrielle is working on this, we have a bunch of measures for
like health.
depression
Yeah,
and
depression.
health and stuff like that. That's in the survey, and that presumably we could slice on all the measures that we have here. In other words, you could disaggregate by gender, by race, by law school status, by social background. So there's actually some pretty robust data in there that we hope to make some use of, but we haven't.
And we
made a
published
lot
it through Wave 2, but we haven't applied it yet to Wave 3.
We haven't applied it. to
And
it
so
yet.
what that shows is that large firm attorneys have worse health,
Yes.
more stress, but because they have higher incomes, they buy all kinds of things that help improve their health.
Yeah.
So when you control for income,
Yeah.
it eliminates some of that difference.
Yeah. So it's a complicated thing, right?
Yeah.
Money actually
But
helps in lots of ways.
Buy your
But
club
it's
membership.
but it's a very interesting set of questions, and one that just for the students in the room, there's way more attention, and Lyle is really a leading person in this, on things like wellness than there ever really has been before, going beyond just the high rates of alcohol and drug dependence and to really trying to think about what more robust measures
Well,
will
our
look like.
Supreme Judicial Court has just issued a big report saying they really want to spend a lot of time and resources on this. And the other quick follow-up question, what advice would you give people around this room for choosing their first job as a result of what you've learned?
Given how important first jobs are.
That is a complicated question, because go where your passion takes you. I mean, there's, one of the papers that just got published from our project, I think it's only available online, is entitled "The New Role of the Corporate Law Firm in Elite Legal Careers." So it's the idea that people who start out in large law firms, even though they leave in very large numbers, I mean, the majority of them leave, it still is a credential they can use throughout their career.
Right.
And so there's still, status benefit from that. Now, and that's true, it's true for income. There's a lot of other indicators that having started in a large law firm have benefits even when you move into other areas, so.
Which has been the pinch of large law
But,
firms,
but
right?
I think, but you need to
Yeah.
go where go where your passion is.
Yeah.
And there are lots of different ways in which you can, get meaningful work, do good jobs, really, good jobs. So.
Yeah,
Did you look at all about like what kinds of discrimination might predict the disparities in income? That like, feeling like you were left out maybe doesn't affect your income, but like I forget what the other categories are.
not getting good assignments or something. There is some,
And there is, and we did do we focused on a client asking for a different attorney, which, that was one analysis in which we did see a sector effect. So the private sector attorneys experience that more often than, public sector or business, which in a way is not surprising because the definition of client is a little ambiguous in those other two sectors. One of the things that I wanted to bring up for class today was what the impact of experiencing discrimination is, on careers. And we haven't looked at directly to earnings, I think, but we have looked at odds of getting promoted to partner, odds of being fired, odds of exiting, either voluntarily or involuntarily. And discrimination, has positive effects on all those negative outcomes, right? And so there are ways that if you control certain variables, you can make some of those discrimination effects go away, but they're pretty robust.
So, two things. One is part of what makes studies like this challenging is, although we have a big sample, when you start disaggregating down to the level of one of 6 kinds versus the other, the ends get small, the numbers get small, and it gets harder to do. We have done some analyses on who makes partner and what the relationship are between, say, having mentors, or here's a variable that actually shows up in the current paper, Bob's, where he spending social time or having meals with partners. In our early studies, this actually had a very robust effect. And it continues for some time and then it begins to disappear. But you're absolutely right. Part of what I think we're trying to do here, what most studies of discrimination focus on the outcomes, and for good reasons, right? They say, so many fewer women are making partners, some women are making so much less than men or whatever. What's much trickier is the mechanisms, which I think all 3 of these questions we're asking, and your question was excellent about, and yours as well. And so we're trying to figure out how to get purchase on that, and there are kind of 2 ways to do it. One is by kind of increasingly sophisticated, multivariate analysis, isolating variables in the quantitative sample, and that gives you the benefit of big numbers, a certain kind of robustness. But again, it's always gonna be pretty crude because there's only so much isolating you can do and it depends on how you ask the questions and there's a lot of squishiness in exactly what people might have meant when they checked a certain thing. And then there's the in-depth qualitative interviews, of which we have kind of two kinds, as you saw here. We have real in-depth, like hour-long, hour and a half long, in-depth qualitative interviews, some of which have been done repeatedly, like with Alicia, across the 3 waves, some of which were only done once. And then we have comments that people, type in. So you say, have you experienced discrimination? If you say yes, please tell us, please write something about which kind, and you can have something there. And that gives you a certain richness, but then it's also much more idiosyncratic. And so the book and some of the methodological challenge of the project is how to try to put the qualitative and the quantitative together in a way that's additive, but also recognizes the limitations of each one. So that's kind of what we're trying to do to tell this bigger story. Yeah, Mark?
Just if you view all
I'm
of this
sorry,
as a quick bill of complaint, what's your prayer for relief at the end?
Thanks.
Well, I mean, there are lots of things. I mean, I think that, I don't know, I think I better,
We'll come back to that. More social science research.
I don't know if it's more of a question or a comment, but I guess the helpful thing about doing these types of surveys is that you get to reinforce what people already believe about the profession. I think the one slide where you had the different, where Professor Wilkins made his comment, I think what you're seeing is, on the whole, it's that people who get into the best undergrad institutions and go to the best law schools go on to the best law firms and then go on to having the best outcomes, which is kind of what we think of, right? And so in the international arbitration world, there's a talk about changing the composition of arbitrators. And so they say pale, stale, and male. And what they're finding now, though, is that there's the diversity initiatives are working, but it's actually turning out to be a criticism that it's like pale, stale, and female.
yeah, right.
So there's not much movement on the racial diversity aspect of the thing. And that makes me think back to something we learned in Professor Wilkins' class. I don't remember the paper that was, but there was a chart that of the types of opportunities that you get when you come in as an associate, the people who get the reach work, have lower marginal productivity, but then end up staying at the firm. So I was curious, like, how are you guys thinking about the racial part of it? Because I think it's much harder to change. And second, how do you think about the ways that people, because of the barriers, even though like it might look that African Americans are getting more represented, but maybe in the top law schools, the racial aspect of it is not as high. So how are you thinking about it in terms of how can people actually succeed in the big law firms when they're not getting in the first place? And how does race play into their kind of growth? But I don't know if that's more of a comment than a question, but yeah, it's just something.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do see differential attrition, for different racial groups, and it may be a bit of a black box, in terms of why, but and it may be just the experience of like a large law firm is now pretty alienating, and when you add racial or gender or sexual orientation discrimination on top of that, people are gone.
I think, this, we'll let you guys go, but Bob can stay around and chat if any people have other questions. I think partly, Alex, what we're trying to, the overarching theme of the book is both the continuity of structures. So one of the things that's just astounding is if you think about all the changes that's happened in the legal profession over the last, since Hines and Laumann first started out, so it's 1975, you're talking about almost, 40, the last 50 years. And yet, it was true in 1975 that if you went to a top law school, you were much more like, we could predict a whole bunch of things about your career, and it's still true today, even though the composition of the people who are going to the top law schools has changed, right? And that's true about a bunch of the superstructure in a way. And yet, there are these stories. It's also true that we can find lots of examples of people who have figured out how to navigate the system in ways that would not have been predicted by the structure. And that's your second example. That's why I think starting with these two examples is brilliant and what we have to do in the book. So how do we understand both the continuity of the structures and yet the ways in which strategies change them, and how does those two things affect each other over time, right? How are the structures shaping the strategies of the people? This is your pale, stale, and female, or pale, stale, and elite, upper crust Nigerian. I mean, it could be the same thing, right? That what you're gonna get, you might get a certain demographic diversity, but you're not gonna get social class diversity or lots of other things we hope we got out of diversity. On the other hand, we have to explain the way in which there are people who are actually changing the system, not just changing their own careers, but changing the system by being there. When my friend Ken Frazier is now the CEO of Merck, which is the largest drug company in the world and maybe one of the 50 largest companies in the world. He's the son of a janitor. His mother died when he was young. And there's a reason why Merck is spending tens of millions of dollars to create an Ebola vaccine that they will never ever get reimbursed for. It's because he said that's what we should do. Now how do you begin to think about that? That's the challenge, I think, and that's what makes it such an exciting project.
Yeah.
And we thank Bob Nelson very much for bringing